Hey guys, tonight we're traveling back to a time when the world economy basically decided to stop working. So, get comfy, dim your lights and maybe grab a blanket, because this one's a slow descent into global chaos, the gentle kind though. The kind where everyone's losing jobs, homes, and sometimes their minds, but from a safe, historical distance. This is the story of how the Great Depression didn't just wreck Wall Street. It quietly unraveled lives across the planet, from farmers in Kansas to princes in London, to factory workers in Berlin, who were about one bad paycheck away from joining a political cult. So take a breath, let's rewind to the Roaring Twenties, because before the crash, everyone was having a suspiciously good time. The calm before the faceplint. The 1920s, the so-called Roaring Decade, was, in retrospect, less of a roar and more of a long, slightly manic giggle before a breakdown. The United States was on top of the world. Jazz was blasting from radios. Flappers were dancing like they were allergic to stability. And stock prices were climbing like someone had replaced gravity with optimism. People were buying cars, radios, refrigerators, and because humans never learned, stocks they couldn't afford. Margin trading, basically borrowing money to buy shares, became a national hobby. You could put down a small deposit and buy 10 times more stock than you actually had cash for. Because what could possibly go wrong with infinite leverage? The answer, of course, is everything, but we'll get there. In Europe, things looked complicated. The continent was still emotionally hungover from World War I, that lovely 4-year-long exercise in mutual destruction. Germany was buried under reparations payments. France was feeling smug but broke, and Britain was clinging to its empire like an aging celebrity refusing to retire. Everyone owed everyone else money. The United States was lending to Germany. Germany was paying reparations to France and Britain, and France and Britain were paying war debts back to the United States. It was like a global game of financial hot potato, except the potato was on fire. October 1929, the week the music stopped. Now picture this, late October 1929. The air in New York smells faintly of coffee, ambition, and bad decisions. The stock market had been jittery for weeks. Then, on Thursday the 24th, it cracked. They called it Black Thursday. Prices started falling. Investors panicked. Phones rang off the hook on Wall Street. There were brokers shouting, people fainting, and somewhere, probably, someone lighting a cigar and pretending it was fine. Spoiler, it was. By Tuesday the 29th, Black Tuesday, it was full-on financial carnage. Billions of dollars vanished in a few days. People who had thought themselves rich were suddenly not. And since so much of that wealth was based on borrowed money, when stocks collapsed, so did banks. Within weeks, tens of thousands of investors were wiped out. Factories started cutting shifts. Farmers couldn't sell crops. And ordinary people, watching their life savings evaporate, did what humans do best: panic quietly, then line up outside banks hoping for mercy. Spoiler, the banks did not offer mercy. How to break a bank in 1930. Back in the 1930s, your local bank wasn't insured. If it failed, your money was gone, poof, like your friend who forgot to pay you back after brunch. As panic spread, depositors rushed to withdraw cash, which made more banks fail, which made more people panic. By 1933, over 9,000 banks in the U.S. had gone under. That's not a typo. 9,000. Factories closed. Wages dropped. Unemployment hit 25%. That's 1 in 4 Americans out of work, which makes today's bad days look like mild inconveniences. The U.S. economy didn't just slow down. It collapsed like a souffle in a thunderstorm. Hoover, the wrong president at the wrong time. And leading the country through all this was President Herbert Hoover. A man who, unfortunately, had the vibe of a well-meaning accountant trying to stop a flood with a calculator. Hoover had made his name as a brilliant engineer and humanitarian. He'd fed starving Europeans after World War I, but the Depression wasn't something you could fix with logistics. He believed in self-reliance, small government, and the magic of markets. So when millions lost jobs, he told Americans to, quote, keep faith in the system, which to a starving person sounds about as helpful as being told to manifest abundance. Hoover did try some things. He launched public works programs, lent money to banks and railroads, and even created the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. But it was all too little, too late. People began calling shanty towns of the homeless Hoovervilles. There were Hoover blankets, ACA newspapers, Hoover flags, empty pockets turned inside out, and my personal favorite, Hoover wagons, cars pulled by horses because people couldn't afford gas. It wasn't exactly a branding win. The Depression goes global. Now here's the thing. The Depression wasn't just an American tragedy. Thanks to international debt, gold standards, and trade links, the U.S. collapse sent shockwaves everywhere. Let's drift over to Europe for a minute. Britain, for one, had never fully recovered from World War I. Their economy was already sluggish. Unemployment was high. And then, boom, the global slump hit. Exports fell. Factories closed. The pound sterling was under pressure, and in 1931, Britain was forced to abandon the gold standard, basically admitting that they couldn't keep their currency backed by shiny metal anymore. The world gasped, economists fainted, and then everyone else did it too. Because once Britain left gold, others realized it was kind of pointless to stay. The world's financial system began unspooling like a badly knit sweater. Germany, when poverty meets politics. Then there was Germany, the land of economic chaos and bad timing. The Weimar Republic had been walking on a tightrope since 1919, juggling reparations, inflation, and resentment. The 1920s had brought a brief, fragile recovery, thanks mostly to American loans. But when the U.S. economy tanked, those loans vanished. German banks collapsed, businesses failed, unemployment soared to nearly 30%. And when people are desperate, they stop caring about democracy and start listening to loud men with mustaches promising easy solutions. Enter Adolf Hitler. The Depression didn't create the Nazi Party, but it handed them power on a silver platter. By 1933, Hitler was chancellor, and the world had officially entered the uh-oh phase of the 20th century. France, Italy, and the rest of the European soap opera. France, being France, tried to act like it was above the whole thing, but it was. Its economy was slower to crash, mostly because it was less dependent on trade and had hoarded gold like a nervous dragon. But by the mid-1930s, even France was sinking into depression, strikes, and political chaos. Italy under Mussolini. Well, Il Duce declared that Italy was immune to capitalist crises, which is exactly the sort of thing you say when your economy is collapsing quietly in the background. The fascist state tried to fix things with public works, propaganda, and yelling, lots of yelling. But Italians still faced shortages, unemployment, and that awkward realization that yelling doesn't make crops grow. Japan and the road to empire. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, Japan's economy was also spiraling. Exports of silk, their main product, collapsed by half. Rural areas starved. And when governments can't feed their people, they tend to get expansionist. Japan's military leaders decided the solution to economic pain was simple: invade somewhere rich in resources. So, in 1931, they marched into Manchuria, a region of China, and just sort of kept it. The rest of the world protested weakly, but mostly everyone was too broke to care. And so quietly, the seeds of World War II were planted, watered by depression, fear, and apathy. Let's check in with the Soviet Union. Then we have the Soviet Union, which, in one of history's strangest ironies, actually benefited from the Great Depression. While capitalist economies were imploding, Stalin's USSR was marching full speed through forced industrialization. Sure, millions died in famines and purges, but from an economic standpoint, the Soviet propaganda department had a field day. They bragged that socialism was immune to capitalist crises. Of course, they didn't mention that the average Soviet worker couldn't find bread. But hey, image is everything. From Wall Street to wheat fields. Let's float back to North America for a second. Because while the cities were suffering, rural America was collapsing in its own spectacular way. Farmers had been overproducing through the 1920s, encouraged by high wartime demand. But prices fell after World War I, and by the Depression, wheat and corn were practically worthless. Many couldn't pay mortgages or taxes, and banks began foreclosing on farms. Then came nature's grand contribution, the Dust Bowl. From 1930 to 1936, severe droughts hit the Great Plains. The overfarmed soil turned to dust and literally blew away. Families packed up and migrated west, thousands ending up in California, living in tents or makeshift camps, hopping for work that mostly didn't exist. It was the kind of collective misery that would later inspire The Grapes of Wrath, which is great literature if you're in the mood for prolonged sadness. Meanwhile, in South America, down in Latin America, things weren't looking peachy either. Most economies there depended on exporting a few key commodities: coffee, sugar, copper, tin, all of which tanked when global trade collapsed. In Brazil, coffee farmers dumped their crops into the ocean because prices were so low it wasn't even worth selling. In Chile, the nitrate industry, once booming, practically evaporated. Governments fell, coups erupted, and dictators suddenly seemed like a great idea. The Great Depression was, in short, a global equalizer, but in the worst possible way. The global domino effect. By the early 1930s, global trade had fallen by about 2/3. That's not a typo, 2/3. Countries responded by raising tariffs to protect local industries, which of course made everything worse. Because when everyone builds trade walls, nobody trades. The US kicked things off with the infamous Smoot-Hawley tariff in 1930, raising import taxes on over 20,000 goods. Other nations retaliated, and soon the world economy was like a group of toddlers refusing to share toys. The result was stagnation, unemployment, and political instability, the perfect breeding ground for extremism. A faint glimmer of hope. And yet somehow, humanity didn't entirely give up. By 1932, Franklin D. Roosevelt came to power in the United States with a calm smile, a cigarette holder, and a promise of a New Deal. He shut down the banks for a few days, reopened only the solvent ones, and reassured Americans that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. He launched work programs, social safety nets, and reforms that still shape the U.S. today. It wasn't an instant cure, more like a long, slow recovery, but it marked the start of a new era, one where governments realized they couldn't just sit back and let markets fix themselves. It was the birth of modern economic management, though, of course, humans being humans, we'd still find new ways to mess it up later. Let's drift out here for now. We've seen the crash, the chaos, and the first faint sparks of recovery. We'll quietly wander through the next decade, how countries tried, failed, and sometimes succeeded in clawing their way out, and how this global collapse quietly set the stage for an even bigger catastrophe. So for now, close your eyes, imagine a world lit by dim lamps, radio voices murmuring about unemployment, and somewhere, a banker staring at his empty ledger, wondering where all the numbers went. When we left off, the Great Depression had wrecked just about everything except the human ability to keep pretending things might improve. And now, in the early 1930s, the world was trying to pick itself up, brush off the dust, and pretend the last few years were just a minor hiccup in capitalism. Of course, it wasn't that simple. Because once you've broken an entire global economy, fixing it is less like turning it off and on again, and more like trying to glue spaghetti back into a tree. But slowly, painfully, a few countries started to stabilize. Others went completely off the rails. Let's ease back in and see who did what. Roosevelt's New Deal, hope with a side of paperwork. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR to his friends and the entire country, walked into office in 1933 radiating calm optimism. He smiled, he spoke in metaphors about fear itself, and he used the word experiment a lot, which is always both comforting and slightly alarming when used by politicians. Roosevelt didn't have one big master plan at first. He had 100 little ideas, most of which boiled down to, try something, and if it doesn't work, try something else. And people loved it. After years of Hoover's do-nothing dignity, FDR's willingness to do literally anything felt revolutionary. He declared a bank holiday, closing every bank in America for 4 days. During that pause, federal inspectors decided which ones were solvent and which were basically piggy banks made of wishful thinking. When banks reopened, people actually lined up to redeposit their money, which was probably the closest thing to a happy ending the 1930s ever produced. Then came alphabet soup. The CCC, WPA, NRA, AAA, and a dozen other acronyms that sound like someone fell asleep on the typewriter. They built dams, planted trees, painted murals, and paid writers to write things that nobody really asked for but everyone kind of needed. For the first time, the U.S. government treated unemployment as a national problem, not a personal failure. And while FDR's policies didn't magically end the Depression, they changed how people thought about the state. The government had become a safety net, albeit a slightly frayed one. Keynesian whispers, and the birth of modern economics. Across the Atlantic, a soft-spoken British economist named John Maynard Keynes was sipping tea and quietly rewriting the rules of money. He argued that during recessions, governments shouldn't tighten their belts, they should spend. Borrow money, build things, give people jobs, boost demand, and the economy will heal itself through motion. It was, at the time, borderline heresy. Politicians loved to preach balanced budgets and moral restraint, as though the economy were a naughty child that needed discipline. Keynes basically said, no, it's a sulky teenager that just needs a little cash and attention. By the mid-30s, even Roosevelt's advisors were secretly reading Keynes under the desk. It wouldn't become official policy until after World War II, but the seeds of modern macroeconomics were quietly germinating under the fluorescent glow of New Deal offices. Britain, austerity and tea. Meanwhile in Britain, things were very British. After leaving the gold standard in 1931, the pound lost value, which shockingly helped exports. Britain started to recover modestly, mostly because it could finally print money again without worrying about hoarding shiny metal in vaults. Unemployment remained stubbornly high in the north and in Wales, where coal and shipbuilding industries collapsed. But down south in London suburbs, you had cheap mortgages and modest growth. It was the strange phenomenon economists call the two Britons, one quietly prospering, one quietly starving, both politely pretending not to notice each other. Politically, Britain spent the decade muddling through coalition governments and promising stability, while doing absolutely nothing interesting. Except, of course, watching Germany with increasing concern, like a neighbor who's building suspiciously large sheds in his backyard and muttering about living space. Germany, from desperation to dictatorship. Let's float back to Germany, where the Weimar Republic was busy collapsing for what felt like the 100th time. By 1932, unemployment had hit 6 million, soup kitchens overflowed, and the country's political scene looked like a chaotic buffet of extremists, communists on one side, Nazis on the other, and a few exhausted centrists hiding under the table. The Nazis, led by our favorite mustached maniac, promised jobs, national pride, and someone else to blame. They held rallies, printed posters, and, crucially, offered simple answers to complex problems. In January 1933, Hitler became chancellor. By the end of the year, democracy was basically gone. Now, from an economic perspective, the early Nazi years were disturbingly successful. Massive public works projects, the Autobahn military rearmament, put people back to work. Of course, this was financed through creative bookkeeping and future war plans. But people saw jobs, bread, and marching bands, and decided not to ask too many questions. Foreign observers at the time even praised Germany's recovery, conveniently ignoring the violent authoritarianism, book burnings, and growing camps of political prisoners. Because, as always, humans will forgive almost anything if the GDP looks good. Italy, fascism in full costume. Italy under Mussolini had entered the 1930s with plenty of swagger and very little cash. The Depression hit Italian exports hard, and the regime responded with theatrical patriotism and ambitious public projects. Mussolini drained swamps, built roads, and declared economic battles with catchy slogans like "Battle for Grain," as though wheat were a rival soccer team. In reality, most of these campaigns were propaganda dressed as policy. Italy's autarky, self-sufficiency, meant fewer imports, higher prices, and worse coffee. But Il Duce stood on balconies shouting about the glory of Rome, and the crowd cheered because the alternative was not cheering. By the mid-30s, Mussolini was feeling left out of the global power club, so he decided to invade Ethiopia in 1935, because when in doubt, conquer something. It was brutal, condemned internationally, and earned Italy a handful of sanctions and a permanent place in the bad decisions section of history. France, democracy by a thread. Across the Alps, France was being France. The economy staggered along, avoiding total collapse but never fully recovering. Governments changed constantly. France went through something like a dozen between 1930 and 1939. The French elite were divided between conservatives terrified of socialism and leftists terrified of fascism. In 1936, the Popular Front, a coalition of socialists, communists, and liberals, somehow won the election. Their leader, Léon Blum, introduced the 40-hour workweek, paid vacations, and collective bargaining rights. French workers basically went on strike out of joy. Of course, business owners were horrified. Inflation rose, and the government collapsed 2 years later. Still, the idea that workers deserved leisure time, actual weekends, survived. So next time you enjoy a Sunday off, you can quietly thank 1930s France for it, possibly while eating bread. The Soviet Union, 5-year plans and famine. Meanwhile, in the land of planned everything, Stalin's Soviet Union was halfway through its first 5-year plan. Industrial output soared on paper, while peasants starved during forced collectivization. The regime exported grain to buy machinery, even as millions died in the countryside. From abroad, the USSR looked like a grim but functioning alternative to capitalist chaos. Western journalists were given carefully choreographed tour of factories and happy workers who somehow all spoke in unison. In private, Soviet citizens were quietly learning that success often meant staying invisible. By the late 1930s, the USSR had become a heavily industrialized dictatorship, efficient in production, terrifying in politics, and basically allergic to human rights. Asia, shadows of empire. In Asia, the Depression's ripples were reshaping the entire region. Japan, still under military influence after its 1931 grab of Manchuria, doubled down on expansion. Trade restrictions from the West convinced Japanese leaders they needed to control their own sources of raw materials. So they looked south to China, to Southeast Asia, and began plotting. In China itself, Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government was juggling warlords, communists, and economic strain. The Japanese invasion of Manchuria destabilized everything, pushing China toward years of brutal conflict that would eventually merge into World War II. Meanwhile, colonies from India to the Philippines felt the depression through falling commodity prices and tightening imperial budgets. Local movements for independence quietly gained momentum, fueled by frustration at distant governments cutting wages while preaching discipline. Latin America, revolutions and dictatorships. Further south, the 1930s became a laboratory for political experimentation. In Brazil, Getulio Vargas rose to power in 1930 and began building what he called the new state, an authoritarian regime with populist flavor. He used nationalism, censorship, and industrial policy to hold the country together, and somehow managed to look both like a savior and a dictator at the same time. Argentina flirted with military rule. Chile swung between democracy and coups. Throughout the continent, governments realized that relying solely on exports to Europe and the US was a terrible plan, so they started promoting local industries, what economists later called import substitution industrialization. It sounded fancy, but mostly meant build it ourselves because nobody's buying our stuff anyway. This inward turn reshaped Latin America's economies for decades, giving rise to new urban middle classes, and also a generation of leaders who believed in eternal presidency. The psychology of despair. It's easy, looking back, to focus on numbers, GDP, unemployment, inflation, and forget that behind each statistic were millions of ordinary lives rearranged by circumstance. Families sharing one bowl of soup, children leaving school to work, fathers walking miles to find non-existent jobs. Photographers like Dorothea Lange captured haunting faces of dust-covered farmers and weary mothers. Images so powerful they're practically the visual soundtrack of the 1930s. The Depression changed culture too. Hollywood gave people escapism. Musicals, screwball comedies, glamorous stars who seemed immune to poverty. In music, swing jazz became the heartbeat of resilience. People danced, not because they were happy, but because they were determined not to drown in gloom. How the Depression redrew the map. By the late 1930s, the global economy was improving slowly. Governments had learned a few things about regulation, welfare, and the dangers of unrestrained speculation. But politically, the world had split into three camps. Democracies trying to reform capitalism, like the US and Britain. Fascist states promising strength through unity and conquest, Germany, Italy, Japan. Communist regimes claiming they'd found the alternative path, the USSR. And between them lay a lot of nervous small countries, hopping not to become someone's next experiment. Foreshadowing the storm. By 1939, unemployment had fallen, trade was picking up, and in America, factories were humming again, partly because of government spending, partly because the world was rearming. The Great Depression, in a cold, ironic twist, finally ended not with peace or policy, but with preparation for war. The economic chaos of the 1930s had quietly rearranged global power. It weakened democracies. It empowered dictators. It convinced millions that radical solutions might be the only ones left. And as the decade closed, storm clouds were literally and metaphorically gathering over Europe. But that, friends, is a whole other insomnia-friendly saga. Government policies to visit the quieter corners of the Great Depression. Because while politicians debated and economists argued, ordinary people were just living through it. Day to day, week to week. Trying to stretch $1 through a month, or a loaf of bread through a family. And in those small, tired lives, you can see the real shape of the Depression not in numbers, but in the ways people changed, adapted, and sometimes just held on. Everyday life, the art of making do. For most people, the 1930s were a long lesson in creative survival. Families who had been solidly middle class suddenly found themselves pawning furniture, sewing their own clothes, or eating beans 5 nights a week. In the cities, soup kitchens became as common as movie theaters. In rural areas, especially across the American Midwest, families patched shoes with cardboard and recycled every scrap of fabric. And people really did save string, because you never knew when you'd need to tie something, and buying new twine was a luxury. Electricity and running water, still not universal. Even in 1935, only about 10% of rural American homes had power. So when Roosevelt's Rural Electrification Administration started wiring the countryside, it wasn't just modernization, it was hope, literally lighting up the dark. You can almost picture it. A farmhouse kitchen, dim oil lamps replaced by a single bulb humming faintly overhead. A small, fragile piece of the modern world, arriving in the middle of despair. The lost generation grows up. The people who had fought in World War I, that disillusioned, lost generation, had already seen the worst the world could offer. Now, as they entered middle age, the Depression forced them to relive instability all over again. Many veterans struggled to find steady work. In 1932, a group of them, calling themselves the Bonus Army, marched on Washington, D.C., demanding early payment of the bonuses they'd been promised for wartime service. They built makeshift camps on the Capitol's outskirts, hoping Congress would listen. Instead, President Hoover sent in the U.S. Army, led, ironically, by General Douglas MacArthur, to clear them out. Tear gas, bayonets, and burned tents followed. The public was horrified. Hoover's popularity, already low, sank like a lead balloon in a swimming pool. It was one of those moments that summed up the decade. A government too cautious, people too desperate, and the space between them filled with smoke. Women in the Great Depression, holding the frayed ends together. While history often paints the Depression in male terms, unemployed men, bread lines, industrial strikes, women were the quiet backbone keeping everything functional. They ran households with surgical precision, stretching small budgets into something resembling life. Homemade clothing, backyard gardens, preserving food in jars. What had once been hobbies became survival strategies. Women also entered the workforce in greater numbers, often in low-paying clerical or domestic jobs. Some men resented it, arguing women were taking men's jobs, but families needed every paycheck they could find. By 1940, women made up nearly 25% of the U.S. labor force, a quiet shift that would only grow during the war years. Culturally, new icons emerged. Actresses like Katharine Hepburn and Carole Lombard, strong, witty women who defied fragile stereotypes. In a world falling apart, self-assured women on screen gave people something to admire, or at least distract themselves with for 90 minutes. Children of the dust and city streets. For children, the Depression was confusing. The grown-ups were worried all the time, the food smaller and the toys fewer. In rural America, kids watched their farms dry up and their families load everything into cars heading west. Photographer Dorothea Lange's image of a weary migrant mother, her face creased, her children clinging to her shoulders, became one of the defining portraits of the era. In cities, children sold newspapers, shined shoes, or stood in line for free milk. Schools shortened terms to save money. And yet, strangely, some children later recalled those years as close-knit families spending time together because there was nowhere else to go. No one had much, so there wasn't much to envy. Culture in crisis, when escapism became art. The Great Depression didn't just shape economies, it transformed culture. When real life looked grim, people turned to art, movies, and music for comfort. Hollywood, rather than fading, thrived. For a dime, you could step into a dark theater and forget your troubles for an hour. Movies sparkled with glamour, Fred Astaire dancing in Tails, Jean Harlow shimmering under studio lights, even though half the audience outside couldn't afford new shoes. It wasn't hypocrisy, it was medicine. As one critic said, in the Depression, movies didn't sell reality, they sold relief. The 1930s also gave birth to some of the most enduring film genres. Gangster flicks like Public Enemy and Scarface, screwball comedies full of sharp dialogue, and the first great animated features. Disney released Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs in 1937, a cheerful fairy tale made during one of the darkest decades in modern history. Because if you're going to make a story about loss, labor, and hope, you might as well include a whistling dwarf or two. Music, dancing, and the ruins. Then there was the music. Swing and jazz ruled the radio, upbeat, brassy, unapologetically alive. Benny Goodman, Duke Ellington, Count Basie, names that filled dance halls even when pockets were empty. It wasn't that people ignored hardship, they danced through it. At the same time, folk music carried the other side of the story, the quiet pain of those left behind. Woody Guthrie, with his dusty voice and guitar that said, "This machine kills fascists," sang about migrant workers, breadlines, and broken dreams. His songs didn't promise comfort. They offered honesty, the kind that made listeners feel less alone. The decade's soundtrack, in a way, was a balancing act between escape and endurance, one brass note of joy for every sigh of struggle. Literature, writing the age of anxiety. The written word didn't stay silent either. Writers across the world tried to capture what it meant to live through collapse. In America, John Steinbeck became the reluctant chronicler of despair. His novel, The Grapes of Wrath, followed the Joad family, fictional, but painfully real, as they fled the Dust Bowl for California. It was banned in several states for being too depressing, which frankly was kind of the point. Elsewhere, George Orwell, who was broke himself, wandered through Paris and London documenting poverty with his trademark dry rage. His 1937 book, The Road to Wigan Pier, described the coal mines and unemployed towns of northern England in microscopic, miserable detail. You could smell the dampness in his words. And in Germany, writers like Thomas Mann and Bertolt Brecht fled into exile, watching their homeland sink into authoritarian madness. The Depression didn't just starve people of money, it starved nations of tolerance and nuance. Art between hunger and hope. Visual artists also felt the tremors. In the United States, painters like Grant Wood and Edward Hopper turned everyday stillness into quiet commentary. Wood's American Gothic, the stern farmer and his pitchfork, became an unintentional symbol of stoic endurance. Hopper's Nighthawks, painted a decade later but born of Depression moods, captured urban loneliness under fluorescent light. Across the Atlantic, surrealists like Salvador Dali were melting clocks and logic alike, reflecting a world where time and stability had both lost meaning. Art in the 1930s oscillated between realism and dreamscape. Some artists documented suffering, others escaped it through imagination. Either way, everyone seemed to agree that the world no longer made much sense. The Depression and race, double hardship. For Black Americans, the Great Depression was not a new disaster. It was an old one getting worse. Unemployment among black workers reached double that of whites. In the South, sharecropping collapsed, and thousands migrated north in what historians call the Second Great Migration. New Deal programs helped some, but excluded others. The Social Security Act initially left out agricultural and domestic workers, jobs heavily held by black Americans. And yet black voters increasingly supported Roosevelt, drawn by his efforts, however incomplete, to acknowledge their struggles. The Harlem Renaissance, that flowering of black art and intellect, began to fade, dimmed by economic hardship. But it left a cultural echo that would fuel later civil rights movements. Even in despair, creativity refused to die quietly. Global ripples beyond the U.S. Of course, the world beyond America wasn't frozen in grayscale either. In Britain, writers like Aldous Huxley imagined dystopias where human individuality was smothered by technology and control, perhaps sensing where modernity was heading. In France, Jean Renoir made films full of melancholy realism, and Pablo Picasso began the long, dark artistic descent that would culminate in Guernica, a scream painted on canvas, born from war but seeded by depression. Even in colonized nations, the shockwaves of the Depression stirred new thinking. In India, Gandhi's movement for independence gained traction, partly because the British Empire could no longer pretend to be economically infallible. In Asia and Africa, nationalist movements quietly noted that Western capitalism wasn't quite as flawless as advertised. The science of survival. Interestingly, the Depression also spurred scientific and social experimentation. Governments began studying poverty systematically, sending researchers to measure calorie intake, housing conditions, and family budgets. It was the birth of what we now call social science. Some innovations stuck, others were weird. The U.S. government funded mural programs to uplift the national spirit, which is a noble goal, but slightly odd when people can't afford food. Still, those projects left behind public art that can be seen in post offices and libraries to this day, a kind of accidental monument to perseverance. The legacy nobody wanted. By the time the 1930s faded into the smoke of World War II, the Depression had reshaped an entire generation's relationship with risk, work, and security. People who lived through it never forgot the fear of losing everything overnight. They saved obsessively, distrusted debt, and valued stability over adventure. That mindset lingered long after the war ended. If you've ever wondered why your grandparents folded aluminum foil to reuse it, or hoarded sugar packets, just in case, that's the echo of 1933 whispering through time. It wasn't paranoia, it was memory. Economics with feelings. The Depression also changed how economists thought about, well, everything. It broke the illusion that markets were self-correcting, or that human behavior could be neatly graphed. Fear, hope, and rumor turned out to be as powerful as gold reserves. When the war finally revived global industry, policymakers vowed never again to let economies collapse unaided. Institutions like the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, created in the 1940s, were direct descendants of Depression-era lessons. In a sense, the Great Depression never really ended. It just evolved, its DNA embedded in every financial safety net and bailout ever since. How it still echoes today. Even now, nearly a century later, its shadow stretches long. Every time the stock market dips, or a bank fails, or a government debates stimulus spending, economists whisper comparisons to 1929. The Depression became the ultimate cautionary tale, the economic boogeyman lurking behind every recession. But beyond finance, its legacy lives in culture. The resilience, the DIY spirit, the skepticism toward unchecked wealth, all of it still shapes how societies imagine fairness and survival. It taught the world that prosperity isn't inevitable, and that sometimes the only thing keeping civilization together is the stubbornness of ordinary people refusing to give up. 1930s and looking upward, toward the people who thought they were steering the world. Because the Great Depression didn't just humble investors, it humbled entire nations. It rewired politics, cracked empires, and lit the fuses that would eventually lead to the biggest war the world had ever seen. All from one financial panic that refused to stay put. Democracy in doubt. The 1930s were a dangerous decade for democracy. When economies collapse, people start losing faith, not just in banks or politicians, but in the very idea that ordinary citizens can manage themselves. You could feel it everywhere. Democratic systems that had survived World War began to wobble. Unemployment soared, food prices crashed, people didn't want speeches, they wanted certainty. And in that atmosphere of despair, strongmen began to sound seductive. Germany, the fragile republic breaks. In Germany, the Weimar Republic was already on shaky ground before the Depression hit. The nation had been humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles, forced to pay reparations it could barely afford. Then came 1929, American loans evaporated, factories closed, and unemployment rocketed past 30%. When you have a country full of hungry, angry veterans, promises start sounding like salvation. And Adolf Hitler, with his mix of grievance and charisma, offered both. He didn't win by force at first. He won at the ballot box, riding on the back of economic desperation. By 1933, democracy in Germany was essentially over. The Depression hadn't caused Nazism on its own, but it built the stage for it, one where fear could masquerade as order. And once that curtain rose, it would take the entire world to bring it down again. Italy, the prototype dictatorship. Meanwhile, in Italy, Benito Mussolini was already in power. He'd seized control in the early 1920s, calling his system fascism, a word that would soon become synonymous with authoritarian swagger. When the Depression hit, Mussolini saw an opportunity. He blamed decadent liberalism for the chaos and tightened his grip, promising an Italy that would be disciplined, united, and eternal. It wasn't, but the dream sold well. The economy sputtered, but the illusion of control was enough to keep him in power, at least until the next World War tore that illusion apart. Japan, from recession to rebellion. Across the Pacific, Japan was also reeling. Its economy depended on exports, silk mostly, and when Western markets collapsed, so did Japan's income. Farmers starved, urban workers rioted. In response, the military began taking control of the government piece by piece. Civilian politicians were seen as weak, generals promised action. And in 1931, Japanese forces invaded Manchuria, starting what would become the first act in the long tragedy of the Second World War. The invasion was partly about resources, coal, land, food, but also pride. Japan felt betrayed by Western powers and decided to rewrite the rules on its own. The Depression didn't just change Japan's economy, it hardened its identity. The Soviet Union, crisis-proof, or so it claimed. Then there was the Soviet Union, the strange exception. While capitalist countries spiraled, Stalin's USSR seemed to grow. Factories expanded, output rose, propaganda blared about five-year plans conquering poverty. From the outside, it looked like communism had weathered the storm. Western intellectuals visited Moscow and wrote glowing reports about the supposed future that works. But beneath the statistics was terror, forced collectivization, famines in Ukraine, purges, and prisons full of dissenters. The Soviet model was less a cure for the Depression then a diagnosis of what people were willing to believe when democracy failed them. Britain, the empire tries to balance its books. Britain, the old imperial banker of the world, found itself broke. Exports collapsed, colonies wobbled, and the pound sterling, once untouchable, was forced off the gold standard in 1931. The government formed a national coalition that was basically a polite panic in committee form. They cut spending, raised taxes, and hoped for the best. Unemployment still reached over 3 million. And in the shadows of London, a young generation began doubting the empire's immortality. It wasn't conquered by an enemy, it was eroded by exhaustion. France, the Republic on edge. France managed slightly better at first. But by the mid-1930s, its political system was paralyzed by infighting between left and right, a miniature version of the global crisis. The far right borrowed ideas from Mussolini, while the left organized massive strikes. When the Popular Front, a coalition of socialist and communist parties, briefly took power in 1936, it introduced paid vacations and shorter workweeks, radical ideas at the time. But the unity didn't last. By 1938, France was back to bitter division, just as the storm clouds of war gathered next door. The United States, the New Deal and the New Faith. And then there was America, where, instead of dictatorship, people got experimentation. Franklin D. Roosevelt didn't have a master plan when he took office in 1933. He had curiosity and optimism, and somehow that was enough. The New Deal wasn't one policy, it was 100 small ones. Job programs, banking reforms, public works, rural electrification, a national patchwork quilt stitched together with trial and error. FDR's famous line, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself," wasn't just rhetoric. It was therapy. For a country that had been in psychological freefall, he offered emotional leadership as much as economic. And though critics called him a socialist, a traitor to his class, or worse, most Americans felt he'd given them back a sense of motion, even if the destination was unclear. The Depression turned FDR into a near-mythic figure, the man who proved that democracy could survive disaster by adapting instead of collapsing. Latin America, revolts and realignments. The Depression hit Latin America hard. Global trade collapsed, and the prices of coffee, copper, and sugar, the region's lifeblood, plummeted. Governments fell one after another. In Mexico, President Lázaro Cárdenas nationalized the oil industry, an act of defiance against foreign companies. In Brazil, Getúlio Vargas rose to power and created a corporatist, semi-authoritarian state, part Mussolini, part Roosevelt, and entirely Brazilian. Across the continent, a new kind of nationalism took root, one suspicious of old imperial ties and eager to build domestic industries. The Depression forced Latin America to look inward, setting the stage for decades of political turbulence and self-discovery. Colonial worlds cracking. The shockwaves reached every corner of empire. When the British and French economies faltered, so did their ability to control faraway territories. Colonial subjects began asking uncomfortable questions. If Europe's systems were so superior, why were they collapsing? In India, Gandhi's movement for independence found new momentum. The Salt March of 1930 wasn't just civil disobedience. It was an act of economic rebellion against imperial monopoly. And in Africa, small but growing nationalist groups began forming, whispers that would grow into shouts after World War II. The Depression didn't end empire immediately, but it loosened the bolts. The rise of economic nationalism. As world trade shrank, countries started turning inward. Tariffs rose, borders hardened. Everyone tried to protect their own industries by shutting out foreign goods, which, Ironically, only deepened the crisis. The U.S. led the way with the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act in 1930, a well-intentioned disaster that triggered global retaliation. It's one of those rare historical moments when almost every economist agrees. Bad idea. By the mid-1930s, the world economy had fractured into rival blocs: the American sphere, the British Empire, and the self-sufficient fascist economies of Germany and Japan. It was like watching globalization in reverse. And when trade stops, diplomacy tends to follow. Ideologies at war. The Depression became an ideological laboratory. Every government, every movement claimed to have the cure for chaos. Fascists promised unity through strength. Communists promised equality through revolution. Democrats promised reform through compromise. None of it was easy. But in the vacuum left by collapsing markets, ideas themselves became weapons. The world wasn't just deciding how to make money again. It was deciding what kind of civilization it wanted to be. By 1939, that question would be answered in fire. The quiet architects of the future. Amid the noise, a few quieter revolutions were happening. Economists like John Maynard Keynes began arguing that governments shouldn't wait for markets to fix themselves. They should intervene. Spend money when times are bad, create demand. It was radical at the time. Today it's basic economics. Keynes' ideas would become the backbone of post-war recovery, the intellectual vaccine against another depression. He once said, "The difficulty lies not in the new ideas, but in escaping from the old ones." In the 1930s, that was basically the story of the world. America's new role. By the late 1930s, something curious happened. While much of the world slid into dictatorship, the United States, battered but still democratic, began to look like a symbol again. Its movies, its jazz, its sheer optimism became cultural exports. Roosevelt's America wasn't perfect, but compared to Europe's chaos, it seemed like a flickering light. When World War II began, that light would matter more than anyone could imagine. Because the Depression hadn't just shaped America, it had prepared it to lead. The Depression's political legacy. When you zoom out, the 1930s feel like a fault line in human history. Before it, the world still believed in the inevitability of progress, that history moved upward like a graph. After it, nobody was so sure. It killed the idea that wealth equals wisdom. It exposed how fragile systems can be, how fast optimism turns to anger, and how fear can elect monsters or visionaries depending on the day. Every modern government, from social democracies to welfare states, carries a trace of the 1930s in its DNA. Policies we take for granted, unemployment insurance, public housing, labor rights, all grew from that soil of crisis. It's almost poetic. A decade defined by loss ended up teaching the world how to care for itself. Closing the circle. So if you imagine the 1930s as a kind of vast, gray theater, the Depression was both tragedy and rehearsal. It tore down old empires, tested new ideologies, and prepared humanity for the storm to come. And when that storm, World War II, finally hit, it wasn't just a geopolitical conflict. It was the second act of the same story. The unfinished argument between freedom, fear, and the price of survival. 1930s, that uneasy twilight where the world pretended to recover, but was really just catching its breath before another fall. Because by now, the Depression wasn't only an economic crisis. It was a psychological one. And nothing changes a world faster than people who have lost faith in it. A fragile recovery. By 1937, in some places, the numbers actually looked better. Factories in the United States were humming again, helped along by Roosevelt's alphabet soup of agencies. In Britain, Rearmament quietly created jobs. Even Germany's unemployment chart was, technically, a success story, though the jobs mostly involved building highways, tanks, or listening to speeches in uniform. But underneath the graphs, the world was still bruised. Trade hadn't really recovered. Currency, blocks, and tariffs carved the planet into economic fortresses. Everyone was rebuilding, but separately, suspiciously. It was like a neighborhood where every house fixed its roof, but aimed a gun at the fence. The illusion of stability. People wanted normal life back so badly that they convinced themselves they had it. In the United States, Roosevelt declared that the nation has regained its balance. In Germany, Hitler called his regime the beginning of a 1,000-year peace. In Britain and France, politicians swore that reason and diplomacy would prevent another war, as if the universe ran on polite optimism. Spoiler, it did not. Germany rearms in plain sight. The Great Depression gave Hitler his stage, and he knew how to use it. Rearmament wasn't just military, it was psychological theater. Roads, rallies, and parades convinced a battered population that Germany was back. And for a while it worked. People got jobs, factories had orders, the radio played marches instead of news about breadlines. The rest of the world noticed but looked away. Britain and France were still broke, still traumatized by World War I, and still hoping that maybe, just maybe, the angry guy in Berlin would calm down once he got what he wanted. He didn't. In 1936, he remilitarized the Rhineland, a direct violation of the Versailles Treaty. The French army could have stopped him in an afternoon. They didn't move. Economic exhaustion had turned courage into paperwork. Italy tries imperialism for fun. Meanwhile, Mussolini, not wanting to be out-fascisted, decided Italy deserved an empire. So in 1935, he invaded Ethiopia, one of the last independent nations in Africa. It was brutal, pointless, and predictably condemned by the League of Nations, which achieved absolutely nothing. Sanctions were symbolic, trade continued, and Mussolini strutted on balconies pretending to be Caesar. The lesson was clear to every dictator watching. The world would protest, but it wouldn't act. Japan expands its empire. Across Asia, Japan kept going. After grabbing Manchuria in 1931, it turned its eyes toward China itself. In 1937, full-scale war erupted after the Marco Polo Bridge incident, a minor skirmish that ballooned into the Second Sino-Japanese War. Japanese leaders framed it as liberation from Western imperialism. In reality, it was industrial conquest, factories, railways, resources. The Great Depression had convinced Tokyo that survival required expansion, not cooperation. The rest of the world, still deep in its economic hangover, mostly sent telegrams and concern. The League of Nations, a sad experiment. Remember the League of Nations, that early attempt at global teamwork. It was supposed to prevent exactly this kind of thing. But by the late 1930s, it had become the diplomatic equivalent of a group chat nobody reads. When Japan invaded China, the League wrote letters. When Italy invaded Ethiopia, it frowned. When Germany broke every rule, it sighed. The League didn't fail suddenly, it withered. And the Great Depression had starved it of the only thing international cooperation really needs: trust. Appeasement, the world tries therapy. So Britain and France invented a new policy: appeasement. Not because they loved Hitler, but because they loved peace, or at least the illusion of it. They told themselves he was a rational statesman with understandable grievances. After all, did Versailles humiliate Germany? Maybe if they gave him a region here, a concession there, he'd be satisfied, and everyone could go back to rebuilding economies and ignoring history. It was the geopolitical equivalent of feeding a bear, Because it looks hungry. Austria and the Sudetenland. In 1938, Hitler moved on Austria. He called it an Anschluss, or union. The League called it illegal. The world called it none of our business. Crowds cheered in Vienna. Dissenters were beaten in the streets. And just like that, Germany grew bigger, stronger, and bolder. Later that same year, he set his eyes on the Sudetenland, the border region of Czechoslovakia filled with ethnic Germans. Cue the famous Munich Conference. Hitler, Mussolini, Britain's Neville Chamberlain, and France's Edouard Daladier sitting around a table, deciding the fate of a country that wasn't even invited. Chamberlain returned to London waving a paper and declaring peace for our time. He was genuinely relieved. So was everyone listening on their scratchy radios. For about 6 months, the Great Depression's psychological debt. It's easy to mock appeasement now, but it made a tragic kind of sense then. The Depression had left whole societies numb. Nobody wanted another war, another wave of widows and amputees. The memory of 1914-18 still haunted every park and family photograph. When economies barely function, people cling to stability, even if it's built on denial. So the democracies bought peace on credit, and the bill came due in 1939. The Soviet Union watches and waits. Meanwhile, Stalin played chess, while everyone else argued over the rulebook. He saw Europe dividing into camps and figured he'd profit from both. The Soviet economy, insulated from global markets, hadn't boomed, but it hadn't crashed either. So while Western leaders worried about budgets, Stalin built tanks and purged anyone who could spell dissent. When Hitler proposed a non-aggression pact in 1939, Stalin agreed. It was cynical, brilliant, and horrifying. The deal secretly carved up Eastern Europe like a pie, half for Germany, half for the USSR. And for a brief moment, two dictators who hated everything about each other became business partners in conquest. Poland, the match ignites. On September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war. And the world that had spent a decade avoiding conflict fell right back into it. Only this time, the weapons, ideologies, and stakes were all far bigger. The Great Depression didn't cause World War II by itself, but it set every piece in motion. Economic collapse created fear, fear created dictators, dictators created war. It's not destiny, it's cause and effect. The United States watches from afar. Across the Atlantic, the United States wanted nothing to do with another European disaster. Isolationism was practically a national mood. Congress passed neutrality acts to make sure no one could drag the country into foreign entanglements again. But even isolation has limits. As the 1940s began, Roosevelt quietly prepared the U.S. for neutral defense, building ships, drafting soldiers, sending aid to Britain. The Depression had taught him that the world's problems eventually cross the ocean, especially when your economy depends on it. From economic despair to global war. When you step back, the 1930s look less like a peaceful decade and more like a long intermission. The same energy that once built railroads and stock markets was now funneled into armies and ideology. Factories that had gone quiet during the crash roared back to life making weapons. Full employment returned by the worst possible method. The Depression solved unemployment, all right. It just outsourced the solution to war. The cost of denial. What's haunting about the 1930s isn't just the suffering, it's how ordinary it all felt at the time. People still went to the movies, listened to swing, married, argued, cooked dinner. Life continued right up until it didn't. The Great Depression taught humanity how quickly normal can dissolve. That's the quiet terror of history. It rarely announces itself. One day you're counting the cost of wheat, The next you're counting refugees. Lessons the world tried to learn. When the smoke finally cleared in 1945, the survivors began rebuilding again, this time with new rules. Institutions like the United Nations, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund were born from the vow, never again. Never again would the world let economic collapse spiral into fascism and war. They didn't always keep that promise, but they tried. And out of that trial came a modern consensus. Governments should intervene in crises, economies should cooperate, and the poor should not be left to starve in the streets while banks gamble with destiny. It's not perfect, but it's better than the alternative. The ghost that never left. Even now, the shadow of the Great Depression lingers. Every time markets crash or currencies wobble, someone dusts off the same old lessons. Don't cut too fast, don't panic too soon, don't let despair pick your leaders for you. We still argue about stimulus, debt, and spending like it's 1933. Maybe that's healthy. Maybe remembering the worst is the only way to keep it from happening again. Epilogue: the long exhale. So here we are, at the quiet end of a loud century. The Great Depression began with paper, stocks, debts, numbers, and ended with rubble. It changed everything: politics, economics, even psychology. And though the world moved on, it never really healed. It just adapted. If you listen closely, you can still hear echoes of those breadlines in modern headlines. Different time, same uncertainty. History doesn't repeat, it mumbles. The world, once shattered, is trying to remember what normal even feels like. It's 1945. The guns have finally gone silent, but the echoes haven't. And the world that crawls out of the ruins isn't the same one that fell into the Depression 15 years earlier. Not by a long shot. The ruins of civilization. Imagine cities like Berlin, Warsaw, and Tokyo flattened. London and Rotterdam half rubble. Factories bombed to dust. Millions displaced, millions dead. The Great Depression had been an invisible disaster, all numbers and fear. The war that followed made the pain visible: broken stones, burned fields, empty eyes. The world wasn't just economically exhausted. It was emotionally bankrupt. And yet, even as the smoke cleared, people started rebuilding. Because that's what humans do. We panic, destroy, and then somehow start making bricks again. America, from depression to dominance. The United States, that hesitant bystander of the 1930s, came out of the war as the planet's only industrial superpower still intact. No bombed cities, no wrecked economy. Factories that once made tanks now made refrigerators. And after 15 years of doubt, Americans felt something new: confidence. The Depression had taught them caution. The war had taught them capability. Together, those lessons turned into the American century, a phrase that would define the next half of global history. The dollar replaced the pound. Hollywood replaced the palace. And jazz, that smoky, improvisational soundtrack, became the sound of modernity. It's ironic, really. The country that had once collapsed under the weight of its own stock market now owned half the world's gold reserves. Sometimes history really does overcorrect. Europe rebuilding from ashes. Europe, on the other hand, was physically and psychologically wrecked. Even the victors were broke. Britain, for all its wartime heroism, was drowning in debt. France was rebuilding its dignity as much as its buildings. But this time, instead of punishing the defeated like they did after World War I, the Allies tried something different. They decided to rebuild everyone, friend and foe alike. Because the last time they didn't, they got Hitler. Lesson learned. The Marshall Plan, Capitalism with a safety net. In 1947, U.S. Secretary of State George Marshall announced a plan to pour billions of dollars into Europe for reconstruction. It wasn't charity, it was strategy. A stable, prosperous Europe would be good for trade, and more importantly, bad for communism. The Soviet Union called it economic imperialism. The West called it aid. Either way, it worked. Factories reopened, railways hummed again, and confidence, that rarest of currencies, slowly returned. For the first time in a long time, Europe believed it could have a future again. And it had the Great Depression to thank for teaching it what not to do. The Soviet Union, power through fear. In the East, Stalin had a different kind of recovery plan, one enforced by bayonets. The Red Army occupied half of Europe, and wherever it went, people's republics sprouted up like gray mushrooms. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, all pulled into the Soviet orbit. On paper, they were independent nations. In practice, they were satellites revolving around Moscow. The Soviet Union emerged from the war as a superpower, but also a traumatized one. It had lost more than 20 million people. Entire cities had ceased to exist. And yet, through that suffering, Stalin convinced his citizens that sacrifice was a kind of glory. The Depression had made him paranoid about capitalist chaos, so he built an empire designed to avoid it entirely. An empire of control. The Cold War begins quietly at first. The strange thing about the post-war years is how quickly the Allies stopped being allies. Within months, the US and USSR, partners in victory, were glaring at each other across ruined Europe. Capitalism versus communism. Freedom versus order. Coca-Cola versus commissars. The world that had once been split by economics was now divided by ideology. Two systems, both convinced the other would collapse first. And at the root of that rivalry was still the ghost of the Great Depression, the memory of what happens when systems fail. Japan, from empire to industry. Across the Pacific, Japan was unrecognizable. The empire was gone. The cities were ash and glass. And yet, beneath the rubble, something remarkable began to stir. Under American occupation, Japan rebuilt, not as a military power but as an industrial one. Education reformed. Factories modernized. By the 1950s, Japan was quietly transforming into the economic miracle that would later shock the world. The Depression had once pushed Japan into imperial conquest. This time, it pushed it into technological innovation. Same hunger, different outlet. Decolonization. Empires unravel at last. Meanwhile, across Asia and Africa, the old European empires were cracking apart. Britain and France, once global landlords, no longer had the money or morale to keep their colonies in line. India won independence in 1947, a polite word for one of the messiest divorces in history. Indonesia followed. Then Africa, bit by bit. You could argue that the Great Depression started this process decades earlier. Economic weakness exposed the myth of European superiority. World War II finished the job. By 1950, the colonial map that once looked like a patchwork quilt of empire was starting to fade. The world was becoming multipolar, messy, proud, and uncertain. The birth of the welfare state. At home, societies had learned something profound. If you don't protect people from collapse, they'll eventually destroy the system that failed them. So from London to Stockholm to Ottawa, new social contracts were written. Unemployment insurance, public housing, universal healthcare, all concepts born from Depression-era fear. It wasn't pure altruism. It was self-defense. Governments finally realized that stability requires dignity, not just GDP. And while the 1930s had been haunted by breadlines, the 1950s would be remembered for baby carriages and television glow. The pendulum had swung, at least for a while. Economics learns humility. The academic world changed too. Before the Depression, economists believed in self-correcting markets, the invisible hand that would gently nudge things back into balance. That hand, it turned out, had dropped the ball. After the 1930s, the new mantra was Keynesianism: spend when times are bad, save when times are good. Governments became economic actors, not just referees. Central banks learned to manage currencies instead of worshiping gold. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. For the next 30 years, the world enjoyed relative prosperity, what the French would call les 30 glorieuses, the 30 glorious years. A golden age born from a gray decade. America and the consumer dream. Back in the United States, something new was happening: abundance. After 20 years of scarcity and war, people wanted color, comfort, and convenience. Suburbs sprawled, cars multiplied, and kitchens became laboratories of optimism. The children of the Depression grew up swearing they'd never live through anything like it again. They built an entire culture around that promise, the American dream. A house, a car, a steady job. Stability as religion. Of course, not everyone was invited. Racial inequality, gender limits, and poverty still lingered beneath the surface. But compared to the desperation of the 1930s, it felt like a different planet. The price of prosperity. The funny thing about success is that it breeds amnesia. By the late 1940s, people began to forget just how bad the Depression had been. You can almost hear it in the music, swing giving way to crooners, then to early rock. The tempo of life sped up, as if the world was afraid to look back. But the lessons were still there, buried in policy, in habit, in quiet anxiety. Every savings account, every insurance policy, every government safety net was a subconscious apology to the past. The New Order. By 1950, the world had a new architecture. The United Nations sat in New York, trying to mediate between superpowers. The IMF and World Bank managed global finance. And NATO formed as a military alliance against the Soviet bloc. It was messy, bureaucratic, and imperfect, but it was order. And after 2 decades of chaos, order felt revolutionary. The Great Depression had begun in the noise of stock tickers. It ended in the quiet hum of office buildings, where men in gray suits promised they could manage the unmanageable this time. History would test them, of course. It always does. The emotional aftermath. For ordinary people, recovery wasn't just about money. It was about trust. After watching systems collapse, governments fail, and wars consume everything, people had to relearn the simple act of believing in tomorrow. That's why the 1950s have that strange, nostalgic glow, even for those who lived through darker times. It wasn't really about innocence, it was about relief. Relief that the world hadn't ended after all. The ghosts that stayed. But ghosts don't leave easily. Behind every modern recession, every financial panic, the shadow of the Great Depression still lingers, reminding economists and politicians what happens when arrogance meets instability. Even today, when the news flashes red arrows and falling indexes, someone inevitably mutters, "Let's not make it 1929 again." It's almost comforting that the worst moment in modern history has become a warning label for the future. A collective scar the world decided to keep. The world learns to sleep again. So by 1950, the world was breathing normally for the first time in 20 years. Factories hummed, bobbies were born. The trauma faded, not erased, but blurred by routine. And yet, if you looked closely, you could still see the fine cracks running beneath it all, reminders that civilization, for all its glitter, remains fragile. The Great Depression had humbled the powerful, exposed the myths of empire, and forced humanity to evolve or perish. It wasn't just an economic event. It was a personality test for the entire species. From Wall Street's crash to World War's rubble, you've seen the world break itself and somehow rebuild again. So now, before we drift off completely, let's lie back and listen to the echoes, the faint vibrations that still hum through our lives, almost a century later. Because here's the thing, the Great Depression never really ended. Not entirely. It just went quiet, hiding inside institutions, memories, and late-night news cycles. Whenever something in the global economy wobbles, that old ghost clears its throat again. And tonight, we're going to follow that echo, slow and steady, like a heartbeat, through the world it helped shape. Echo 1, the fragile faith in money. Let's start with something deceptively simple, trust. Money, at its core, is nothing more than collective belief. A piece of paper, a number on a screen, a symbol we all agree to pretend has meaning. In the roaring 1920s, that faith was unshakable. By 1933, it had collapsed completely. People lost trust in banks, in markets, in governments, and most dangerously in each other. That loss of faith left a scar so deep that it changed how the entire world treated finance. Regulations, insurance, oversight, all born out of the sheer terror of waking up one day and finding your life savings gone. So every time you check your bank balance or file your taxes, you're living in a world designed by Depression survivors. A world obsessed with making sure the numbers don't suddenly stop adding up. Echo 2, the political pendulum. Then there's politics, which, during the 1930s, swung like a wrecking ball between extremes. The Depression didn't just destroy wealth, it destroyed certainty. In that vacuum, strongmen rose, democracy stumbled, and ideologies sharpened their claws. Communism promised equality. Fascism promised order. Capitalism promised it would do better next time. The result was the century's great ideological divide, one that outlived even its founders. The Cold War wasn't really about missiles and borders. It was about economic faith systems trying to prove which one could survive another collapse. And even now, in the 21st century, when people argue about socialism or free markets online, they're unknowingly reenacting a debate that began in the breadlines of 1932. Same anxiety, just with better Wi-Fi. Echo 3, the safety nets. The 1930s taught governments a painful truth. If you abandon people during a crisis, they'll abandon you right back. That's why, after the Depression, countries began weaving social safety nets, systems designed not out of kindness, but self-preservation. Unemployment insurance, public health programs, food stamps, Social Security. All of them were political seatbelts, keeping society from flying through the windshield during the next economic crash. Of course, those systems weren't perfect, and still are. They get trimmed, debated, exploited, or neglected. But without them, every modern downturn would look a lot more like 1930. So when you hear the term welfare state, remember, it's not a luxury. It's a survival instinct written into law. Echo 4. The psychology of scarcity. The Depression didn't just change policies, it changed people. An entire generation grew up watching their parents count every penny, reuse every scrap, save every jar. And even decades later, when those people had money again, they never quite stopped saving string. Psychologists call it scarcity trauma. Economists call it the thrift effect. You and I might just call it grandma washing aluminum foil. It's a strange inheritance, a quiet, persistent frugality passed down through families like an old superstition. It whispers things like, "Don't waste that," or "You never know when things will go bad again." Because once you've lived through total uncertainty, you never really stop bracing for it. Echo 5. The myth of constant growth. Before 1929, economists believed in something like perpetual motion, the idea that markets would naturally expand forever. The crash was a rude reminder that gravity exists. Ever since, the world has been obsessed with measuring growth. Every quarter, every government, every news anchor asks, are we expanding? Are we shrinking? As if the economy were some kind of living creature that needs to be constantly fed optimism to survive. But growth has a shadow side. When it stalls, panic sets in. Because somewhere deep down, the memory of the 1930s still whispers, decline means disaster. The truth, of course, is more complicated. The world doesn't end every time the numbers dip. But the fear that it could, that's the Great Depression talking, still echoing in stock charts and investor anxiety nearly a century later. Echo 6. The culture of control. Governments learned something else from the Depression, that economic chaos leads to political chaos. So after 1945, they built institutions designed to manage the unmanageable. The International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, central banks with mysterious powers to stabilize markets. All of them were, in their own bureaucratic way, monuments to the trauma of 1929. They exist to make sure the global economy never spins completely out of control again, or at least to give the illusion that someone's driving. It's comforting in a way. We like to believe there's a grown-up somewhere in the room, even if that grown-up is just printing more money and hopping no one panics. Echo 7. The return of the old ghost. Fast forward to 2008. Different century, same story. Banks collapsing, markets spiraling, panic spreading faster than any virus. It was, for a brief moment, 1929 all over again, only with smartphones. Governments, remembering their grandparents' mistakes, moved quickly this time. They spent, bailout out, stabilized, and printed like there was no tomorrow. And in doing so, they prevented another full-scale depression. But the echo was unmistakable. Every headline, every analyst, every nervous whisper invoked that same word, depression. It wasn't just historical shorthand. It was generational muscle memory. Because when the modern world gets scared, it reaches back for the oldest fear it knows, the fear of total collapse. Echo 8. The legacy of humility. For all its suffering, the Great Depression did one good thing. It humbled humanity. Before 1929, people believed they could engineer perfect systems, economic, political, social. Afterward, they learned that perfection is an illusion. Every policy, every market, every empire carries the seeds of its own unraveling. That realization didn't make humanity wiser overnight, but it did make it slightly less arrogant. Maybe that's why post-war societies leaned into moderation. They didn't trust extremes anymore, not after seeing where desperation led. That subtle caution, that reluctance to gamble everything again, became one of the century's quiet virtues. Echo 9. The persistence of inequality. Of course, the Depression didn't erase inequality. It just rearranged it. The rich lost fortunes in 1929, but they recovered faster. The poor lost livelihoods and often never recovered at all. Sound familiar? Every recession since has followed the same script, because the structures that divide wealth are stubborn. The Great Depression forced governments to regulate capitalism, but it couldn't make capitalism fair. So yes, we got social programs and banking laws, but we also got billionaires again, and boom-bust cycles that feel a little too déjà vu for comfort. History's sense of irony remains undefeated. Echo 10. The art of resilience. Still, for all the mistakes, the Depression left behind one priceless inheritance: endurance. That generation endured droughts, hunger, fascism, war, and rebuilding, and still found time to dance to swing music. They carried a toughness that modern life, for all its comforts, sometimes forgets. It's the quiet kind of resilience, not heroic, not loud. Just the stubborn refusal to give up, even when the odds look ridiculous. It's the sort of strength that only exists in people who have already lost everything once. And maybe that's the final echo, the most human one of all. The ability to start over, again and again, without ever being sure it'll work. Echo 11. The memory in the numbers. Look at an old photo from the 1930s. A man in a suit selling apples on a street corner. Children barefoot in dust. A soup kitchen line stretching around the block. Those images aren't just history, they're warning signs carved into memory. That's why economic charts from the era are still shown in classrooms. Not because we enjoy looking at disaster, but because we need to remember what it looked like. The Depression wasn't just about numbers falling. It was about people realizing how fragile modernity really was, and still is. And that knowledge, uncomfortable as it may be, is part of what keeps the world awake at night. The sleep of history. And so, as we finally close the book, here's the gentle truth. The Great Depression was not just a moment. It was a mirror, showing humanity what happens when optimism outpaces caution, when greed outruns empathy. It broke the illusion of endless progress, and in its place left something far more valuable: awareness. Awareness that systems are fragile, that wealth is not wisdom, that progress can stall, and yet life continues. The world we live in today, globalized, regulated, cautious, ambitious, is the uneasy balance born from that decade of despair. And now the quiet part. If you've made it this far, take a slow breath. You've drifted through stock markets, soup lines, dust storms, and battlefields, all from the comfort of your bed. The story of the Great Depression isn't just about economics. It's about the fragile balance between hope and hubris. It's about what happens when the world forgets that balance, and what it takes to rebuild it again. So next time you see a headline about markets crashing or global uncertainty, just remember, we've been here before. We got through it once. We'll get through it again. The rhythm of history is steady, even when it sounds like chaos. And somewhere in that rhythm, the world keeps rocking itself back to sleep. The final whisper. The Great Depression began with noise, the frantic click of stock tickers, the shouting on trading floors. It ended in quiet, the hum of rebuilding, the slow heartbeat of recovery. And maybe that's how all great stories end. Not with fireworks or triumph, but with silence. A reminder that survival in the end is the most human achievement of all. So as the lights fade and the night deepens, Remember the people who lived through it and what they built afterward. Not perfect, not peaceful, but better. Always somehow better. Good night. Sleep well. History will still be here in the morning.